A quiet walk home becomes a nightmare when a racist cop strikes a young black woman in the head with a baton. No warning, no cause, just pure brutality. They think they've shut her down with false charges and a falsified report. But they picked the wrong woman. She's a law student with ties to federal courtrooms, and her sister is a powerful judge who doesn't play games. What starts as an assault turns into a federal investigation that exposes corruption, shakes an entire department, and brings a crooked officer to his knees. This isn't just a story, it's a turning point. Stay with us, you won't believe what happens next. Let us know where you're watching from and what time you're tuning in. Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. It was just after 9 p.m. when Leona stepped off the last bus at the corner of Baxter and 3rd, the soles of her sneakers pressing softly into the damp concrete. The evening air still carried a faint scent of rain, pavement, sweat, and wet leaves curling at the edges, and above her streetlights buzzed with that sickly yellow glow that always made her feel like she was moving through a memory instead of the present. She tightened her grip on the canvas bag slung across her shoulder, adjusting it to avoid the growing ache in her back, and started walking toward the small duplex she rented 2 blocks down. The streets were quiet, a little too quiet, like the calm that comes when everyone in a neighborhood has already drawn their blinds and turned the volume down, not out of comfort but out of habit. She kept her pace steady, the rhythm of her steps almost meditative, letting her mind drift back to the lecture from earlier constitutional protections in the face of state overreach. Her professor's voice still echoed in her head, sharp and precise. You may know your rights, but you'd better know how to survive long enough to claim them. At the time, the class had laughed quietly, not because it was funny, but because it was true, and truth always earned a nervous chuckle in rooms full of future lawyers. Leona wasn't laughing now. She glanced over her shoulder, not because she heard anything, but because after 28 years of being black and female in this country, you learn to check the shadows even when they're silent. It was then she saw it, the slow crawl of a police cruiser, making its way down the street behind her headlights, off tires, whispering against the curb. She didn't panic, not outwardly. She had trained herself for this, not just in law school, but in life. Her mother used to say, "Don't ever give them your fear. If you give them that, they'll take the rest." So she kept walking, heart ticking a little faster, lips pressing into a line so thin it felt like her mouth disappeared. The cruiser inched closer. Then the chirp of the siren broke the air, short, sharp, and deliberate. She stopped, slowly turned, hands visible, calm. Evening came the voice from the driver's side, casual but edged like a blade, dulled just enough to make the cut hurt longer. The officer stepped out, white, mid-40s, square build, dark utility vest, clinging to a body used to being obeyed. His nameplate read Murney. The other officer, younger, stayed inside, engine still idling, one hand on the wheel, the other near the radio. Leona looked at Murney square in the eye. "Is there a problem, officer?" He smirked like he'd been waiting for her to speak. "That depends," he said, taking slow steps toward her. "Where you headed tonight?" She answered simply. "Home." She nodded toward the direction of her building but didn't take a step. "You live around here?" His tone sharpened like he was poking a bruise he hoped would swell. "Yes," she replied, steady. "Just down the block. I'm a student. I just got out of class." Murney looked her up and down, his gaze pausing just long enough to be offensive. "Got any ID?" he asked. "Sure," she said. "It's in my bag. May I reach for it?" He shrugged. "Go ahead." But something about the way he said it made her hesitate. Something in the angle of his jaw, in the way his hand rested too close to the baton on his belt, told her this wasn't about her ID. This was about something else, some story he'd already written in his head, and she was just supposed to play her part. She moved slowly, deliberately, one hand holding her bag open, the other reaching inside. As her fingers brushed against the leather of her wallet, she heard him shift his weight, his boots scuffing the sidewalk. She looked up, and for a brief moment their eyes locked, hers wide, his narrow. "You seem nervous," he said, stepping in closer. "Why would you be nervous if you haven't done anything wrong?" "I'm not nervous," she said, though her breath betrayed her. "I just prefer to be careful." He chuckled, but it wasn't amusement, it was control. "You fit the description," he added casually, almost like an afterthought. Of what she asked. Her voice was calm, but there was steel in it now. "We had a report of a theft nearby. Black female, late 20s, athletic build." "Sound familiar?" "No," she said. "It doesn't." She kept holding her wallet still unopened, unsure if handing it over would calm him or provoke him. The younger officer stepped out, then his presence quieter, less assured. He looked at her for a moment, just long enough for her to see the hesitation, but said nothing. And just like that, the wind changed. Something in the air grew heavier. The silence between them tightened, pressing against her chest. She knew this game, knew the steps, knew the looks, knew that no matter how polite she was, no matter how clearly she spoke, she could not control the version of her that Murney would write in his report later tonight. So she took one last breath deep and full of everything she wanted to scream and said, "I'd like to speak to your supervisor." That was the moment his smile disappeared. Not anger, not surprise, something colder. Something like calculation. "You don't get to make demands," he said, stepping even closer. "Not out here, not tonight." And in that instant, Leona understood exactly where she stood, not on a sidewalk in her neighborhood, but at the edge of a cliff where the wrong word, the wrong blink, the wrong twitch could send everything tumbling down. She stood still, back, straight bag, still open, heart still pounding. The street was quiet, the rain had long stopped, but in her ears, thunder had begun. He took another step forward, the heels of his boots clicking against the sidewalk in a rhythm that didn't match her heartbeat, but seemed determined to control it. Leona didn't move. She could feel the tightness in her throat rising, not from fear, but from restraint. The kind of restraint you learn not in classrooms, but in life where every breath is a calculation, and every gesture can be misread as a threat. Officer Murney's hand drifted casually, almost theatrically, toward the baton hanging at his side, his fingers brushing the polished handle like he was petting a favorite weapon. "I'm going to need you to put your bag down and turn around," he said, voice still smooth but now low and edged like a warning carved into ice. Leona didn't answer right away. She looked at him, then at the other officer, Cowley. She thought she'd heard someone call him and wondered for a brief and flickering second if he would intervene. But Cowley stood still, arms crossed, jaw-tight eyes shifting from her to the wet concrete and back again. He wasn't a monster like Murney, but he wasn't about to risk anything either. The air around them had shifted. There was no more pretense of protocol or procedure, only the growing weight of one man's authority pressing down on her chest like a boot before it moves to crush. She spoke slowly, her voice firm but measured. "Officer, I haven't done anything wrong. I'd like to know what law I'm breaking by walking home." Murney's smile returned, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. It was thin, tight, and full of something darker than arrogance. "You're being uncooperative," he said. "That's how problems start." The moment hung between them like static before a lightning strike, and Leona knew without question that this wasn't about theft or suspicion or any real crime. It was about compliance, submission, control. She raised her hands slightly, not out of surrender, but as a symbol, a silent statement that she had nothing to hide and everything to lose. "I'm reaching for nothing. I'm standing here unarmed and I want to go home." Her voice didn't shake, but it rang louder than she intended, bouncing off the nearby brick buildings like a dare. Murney's eyes flicked sideways, then back to her. "Ma'am, this is your last warning." That word "ma'am," delivered like an insult rather than a title laced with disdain, cracked something in her. But she didn't show it. She couldn't afford to. Then it happened so fast it would later blur in her memory, not from trauma but from disbelief. He stepped forward, reached with his left hand as if to grab her arm, but when she reflexively stepped back, his right hand shot up baton, gripped tight, and without a word or hesitation he swung. The blow landed just above her left eyebrow with a sharp, sickening sound, like a dull branch cracking against a stone. Her vision flashed white, then red, and the sidewalk seemed to tilt beneath her feet. She staggered back, slipping from her shoulder, knees buckling not from weakness, but from the sheer force of surprise. There was no warning, no command, no cause, only the taste of blood flooding into her mouth and the copper smell rising fast into the cold night air. She fell to one knee, hand pressed against her temple, warmth spilling down her face in thick, sticky lines. She could hear her own breath, shallow and uneven, mixing with the low hum of the cruiser engine and the distant bark of a dog somewhere down the block. For a second, the world narrowed to a point, just her, the concrete, and the impossible throb of her skull. "What the hell was that?" Cowley's voice cut through the silence like a blade, high-pitched and unsure. She wasn't resisting Murney, didn't even turn to look at him. "She moved," he said, flatly like that, explained everything. "She moved and I acted." He holstered the baton with mechanical precision. The click of it, locking back into place louder than it should have been. Leona tried to speak, to form words through the pain, but nothing came out, only a low guttural sound, something between disbelief and resolve. She forced herself upright, one hand still pressed to her head, the other clutching her bag, now lying on the ground. "You assaulted me," she whispered, and even in that whisper was something unbreakable. Murney tilted his head, finally facing her. "You gonna file a complaint?" he sneered. "Good luck with that." Cowley looked away, jaw-clenched hands, fidgeting with his utility belt like a kid, unsure whether to run or fight. His silence was deafening. Leona stood fully now, blood running freely, spine straight despite the throbbing. She knew what this was. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a bad call. It was a choice, a decision made long before she ever crossed the street tonight. She took a deep breath, shaky but full, and locked eyes with the man who had tried to knock her out of herself. "I want medical attention," she said, clearer now. "And I want your badge number." Murney exhaled through his nose like someone who'd just been mildly inconvenienced, then turned toward the cruiser. "You'll get a report," he muttered, grabbing for the radio. "But you're coming with us first." Leona didn't flinch. She reached down, picked up her bag with slow, deliberate movements and wiped her hand, now smeared with her own blood on the side of her jeans. The fabric stained quickly, crimson spreading like a bruise across denim. Behind her, the rain had left puddles that reflected distorted streetlights, bending her shadow into something taller, sharper, harder than before. As they led her to the car, the younger officer finally spoke again, voice barely audible. "I didn't sign up for this," he mumbled. Leona didn't answer. She just stepped forward on her own head still high, despite the blood, despite the pain, despite the knowing. She wasn't defeated. Not tonight. Not here. Not by him. And not like this. The police cruiser smelled like vinyl bleach, and something metallic she couldn't name, maybe blood, maybe fear. And as Leona sat in the back, hands cuffed too tightly behind her, the hard plastic seat pressed into her spine with every bump in the road. The red and blue lights still flickered against the buildings outside, but no siren accompanied them now. Only the low hum of tires on wet pavement and the occasional crackle of the police radio filled the silence between the officers in the front. Murney drove like someone used to getting away with things, one hand lazily draped over the steering wheel, the other tapping the dashboard in rhythm with a tune only he could hear. Cowley sat stiffly beside him, arms crossed, eyes fixed on nothing, jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might snap. Leona's head throbbed with every turn, every jolt, every flicker of movement. She could feel the blood drying in her hair crusting along her temple, and the way her vision blurred every time she blinked reminded her she probably needed stitches. But she didn't ask for help anymore, not because she didn't need it, but because she knew they wouldn't offer it. Not now, not willingly. Her breath came slow and controlled, not because she was calm, but because she had to be. Panic was a luxury she'd never been allowed. At the station, no one rushed. No one questioned the cuffs, the blood, or the grimace that flashed across her face when they pulled her roughly from the back seat. The front desk sergeant barely glanced up from his paperwork. "Another one?" he asked. "Yeah," Murney grunted. "Resisted arrest. Got violent." Leona opened her mouth to protest, but Murney leaned in close enough for her to smell the bitter coffee on his breath and said low and slow, "You say one word out of line and I'll say you lunged at me." Again. Then he smiled. Not like someone amused, but like someone who enjoyed being unchallenged. The booking room was cold, too cold for spring, and lit with fluorescent bulbs that buzzed faintly overhead, casting everyone in a pale, colorless haze. The fingerprint scanner didn't work on the first try, her fingers too bloodied to register properly, and the officer processing her made no effort to be gentle. "Name," he barked, not bothering to look her in the eye. "Leona Hayes," she replied, voice calm, lips dry. "Occupation law student, DOJ intern." The man paused for just a beat, then scoffed like he didn't believe her or didn't care. They photographed her with a swollen eye, a busted brow, and blood-stained jeans. Then led her to a holding cell with cracked tiles, a metal bench, and the kind of silence that pressed against your chest until it felt like breathing through wet cloth. She sat on the farthest end, legs curled in slightly back against the wall, hands resting quietly in her lap. Every movement hurt her head, her shoulders, the tightness in her ribs, but she didn't cry. She wouldn't give them that. Crying, she'd learned, was something they expected from people they thought were weak. She wasn't weak. She was just tired. In the squad room, Murney stood over a terminal typing out his report. "Suspect resisted verbal commands," he muttered as he typed. "Suspect became combative. Officer deployed appropriate force. No injuries sustained by officers." He paused, glanced over his shoulder to make sure no one was watching, then deleted a line and added, "Suspect attempted to flee. Officer intercepted." Cowley sat nearby, hunched forward, tapping a pen against the desk, face pale. "You hit her in the head, Dale." No warning, just bam. Murney didn't look up. "You want to file a complaint?" he asked. "Be my guest." "But you were there. You didn't stop me. That makes you part of it." Cowley looked away, running a hand down his face like he was trying to wipe the night off of it. She didn't do anything. Murney finally stopped typing. "She fit the description. That's enough. Don't start growing a conscience now. We've got enough paperwork as it is." He hit save. The screen blinked. The lie was now a file number in a system that didn't care. Back in the cell, Leona leaned her head against the wall and closed her eyes, letting the cold seep into her skin as a kind of anchor. She thought of her sister, Judge Regina Hayes, probably asleep by now, unaware that her younger sister had become another name on another form, another statistic, dressed up in legal language. "You okay?" a low voice asked from the hallway. She opened her eyes. Cowley stood outside the bars, not looking directly at her, just sort of hovering. "I'm fine," she said, though the blood had soaked through her shirt collar now and was slowly drying against her neck. "You should get looked at," he said. "Maybe." She didn't move. "Are you going to write the truth?" she asked him quietly. Or are you going to protect your partner?" He didn't answer, just turned and walked away. She sat alone for another hour, maybe more, the ticking of the wall clock louder than the voices down the hall. Somewhere nearby someone was laughing, but it didn't sound like joy. It sounded like habit, like the kind of laugh people use to fill spaces where the truth might echo too loudly. Leona leaned her head back again and whispered to no one, "They have no idea who I am." And though her body hurt, and her future now lived inside a false report, something inside her held firm, unshaken, not rage, not revenge, but resolve. The kind that doesn't roar, the kind that waits. It was almost 3 in the morning when they finally let her make her phone call, her hands still raw from the cuffs, and her forehead throbbing beneath the hastily applied gauze that stuck unevenly to her skin. The holding cell had gone quiet save for the low buzzing of a flickering light overhead and the occasional creak of a chair shifting behind the booking desk. Leona held the receiver in both hands, her fingers trembling slightly, not from fear anymore, but from the cold, the exhaustion, and something deeper that she hadn't yet named. The phone cord twisted around her wrist as she dialed the number from memory, a number she hadn't used in months, not because they weren't close, but because they both knew how dangerous it was to be tied together in public. She listened to the rings, 1, 2, 3, and then the line clicked. Her sister's voice came through low, gravelly, cautious. "Regina Hayes." Leona exhaled slowly, the way people do when the world starts to loosen its grip on their throat. "It's me," she said. There was a pause, a silence thick enough to step into. "Where are you?" Regina asked, no hesitation in her voice now, only calculation. "County Station," Leona replied. "False charges. I need you to listen carefully." "I didn't resist, but he struck me. Baton to the head. They're trying to bury it." The line went quiet again, but it wasn't dead. She could hear the rustling of sheets, the creak of a bedside lamp being turned on the shuffle of papers being moved aside. Regina didn't waste time with questions that didn't matter. "Name?" she asked. "Murney. First name, Dale. Partner is Cowley, younger, quiet." Regina scribbled something down the scratch of pen on paper, steady, precise. "Hold tight," she said. "Don't speak to anyone else. I'll handle the rest." Leona hung up the click of the receiver louder than she expected, echoing slightly in the quiet hallway. She turned, stepped back into the cell without being told, and sat down on the same cold bench this time, folding her arms tightly across her chest. She stared straight ahead, not at the wall or the door, but at something beyond the space, something only she could see. A courtroom, a hearing, a reckoning. Back in her office, Judge Regina Hayes moved like a woman who had trained her whole life for moments like this. Her night robe hung loosely over her shoulders as she opened her laptop screen, glowing blue in the early hours, fingers already flying across the keyboard. She pulled up federal records, cross-checked Murney's badge number, reviewed disciplinary reports buried under layers of bureaucracy. 1 complaint, 2 closed investigations, 1 body cam footage conveniently corrupted after a suspect required hospitalization. It wasn't a surprise, it was a pattern, and now it had touched blood that belonged to her. She made 3 phone calls, 1 to the DOJ's Civil Rights Division, 1 to the local federal prosecutor, and 1 to a contact in internal affairs who owed her a favor he hadn't expected to cash in so soon. She didn't shout, didn't plead, didn't explain too much. She spoke in measured tones, each sentence a line of legal precision wrapped in quiet rage. "You'll want to handle this off the books until sunrise," she said more than once, "because once I go public, there won't be any coming back." By dawn, the wheels were turning. At the station, Officer Cowley stood in the break room, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee he hadn't touched. His knee bounced under the table, a nervous twitch he hadn't been able to stop since the report was filed. He told himself he wasn't complicit, that silence didn't count as violence, but the way Murney had smiled after the baton landed haunted him like a bad dream he couldn't wake from. He kept replaying it, the look on her face, not just pain but betrayal, like she'd seen it before too many times to be surprised anymore. Across the hall, Murney sat at his desk, boots kicked up, tapping out a text with a smirk that hadn't left his face since the paperwork cleared. "Another one for the books," he muttered. "No big deal." But he hadn't noticed the shift in the atmosphere yet, the way dispatch stopped making eye contact, the way the station doors creaked open just a little too early for the next shift. He didn't see the 2 unmarked cars pull up in the side lot, didn't see the plainclothes agents step out with folders under their arms and badges clipped to their belts in that unmistakable way that said, "We're not here to ask." In the holding cell, Leona sat with her eyes closed, but she wasn't asleep. Her breathing was steady now, the kind you learn from years of learning how to wait with dignity, how to survive long enough to speak the truth at the right time. She could feel the bruise swelling above her eye, the tightness along her jaw where the skin had split, but she didn't focus on that. Instead, she repeated her sister's words silently to herself like a quiet prayer. "Hold tight, I'll handle the rest." And somehow, despite the night, despite the cuffs, despite the silence that had swallowed her whole, she believed it. Not because she needed hope, but because she had something better: memory. Memory of the courtroom where Regina once stood alone and made a room full of doubters sit down and listen. Memory of her own voice, steady and calm, cross-examining witnesses in mock trials where she was never supposed to win. And memory of every time she'd been told to be quiet and had instead chosen to prepare. She smiled just a little, not out of relief, but because the shift was coming, and they didn't even know it yet. The knock came just before 7 a.m., sharp and deliberate, like the sound of someone who already knew they didn't need permission to enter. The front doors of the station creaked open, and in stepped 2 federal agents in plain suits, the kind with worn leather briefcases and tired eyes, who didn't flinch at the smell of stale coffee or the hollow echo of boots on linoleum. They didn't announce themselves loudly or flash their badges like in the movies. They simply walked in quiet and steady, the way people do when their authority doesn't need explaining. The morning shift had barely started, and already the entire energy inside the building shifted. Something in the air slowed, as if time itself had paused to listen. At his desk, Officer Dale Murney glanced up from his phone, half-chewed pen between his teeth, and caught the movement just past the bullpen. He didn't recognize the men, but he didn't need to. He knew that kind of presence. He leaned back in his chair, raising an eyebrow, but kept his expression blank, confident. He'd danced with internal affairs before. He'd beaten back complaints, sidestepped suspensions, and buried his mistakes under enough paperwork to make a desk drawer groan. To him, this was just another inconvenience, something he could laugh about later with the boys at the bar. Across the room, Officer Cowley sat stiffly, eyes darting toward the agents, before quickly returning to the cold coffee in his hand. His fingers tightened around the styrofoam cup knuckles, pale, as if somehow gripping it harder would hold back the truth, clawing its way through his conscience. He hadn't slept. He hadn't gone home. And now, as the agents moved closer, he felt the thin layer of distance he'd tried to maintain begin to collapse. Detective Murney, one of the agents, asked, stopping just short of his desk. The room quieted. Chairs stopped squeaking. Conversations hung mid-sentence like forgotten thoughts. Murney stood slowly, straightening his belt with a smug kind of patience. "That's me," he replied. "What's this about?" The older agent, tall with a salt and pepper beard, didn't smile. "We're here to discuss the incident involving Miss Leona Hayes. We have some questions about your report." Murney's jaw twitched, but he didn't falter. "Happy to help," he said, and motioned toward the back conference room with exaggerated politeness. "Let's talk." But even as he led them away, his mind was spinning not with fear but with calculation. He assumed the girl had tried to pull strings, maybe even threatened a complaint, but he wasn't worried. He had written hundreds of reports. He knew how to control the story. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have guessed, was that Leona Hayes had a sister who wore a black robe and sat behind a federal bench. In a quiet corner of the station, Leona sat across from a nurse sent in by the federal team. Her temple freshly stitched, her vitals taken with a tenderness she hadn't expected to receive inside this building. She said little, answered only what was needed, her voice soft but deliberate. Every so often, her eyes wandered to the hallway beyond the glass where Cowley stood, shifting his weight from foot to foot, like a man trying to decide whether to stay or run. When their eyes met, she didn't blink. She didn't look away. She simply waited. Eventually, he stepped into the room. "I didn't know it would go that far," he said, voice cracking under the weight of his own failure. "He just hit you. And I didn't do anything." Leona didn't raise her voice. "You didn't stop him," she replied. "You helped him write the lie." Cowley nodded slowly, his face pale, his lips drawn tight, like a man walking to the edge of a cliff. "I want to fix it," he said. "Tell them what really happened." In the adjoining conference room, Murney's story began to unravel under the weight of cold facts. The agents had recovered backup footage from a street camera across the road, silent, grainy, but clear enough to show the moment his baton rose and fell, the absence of threat, the unprovoked violence. The timeline in his report didn't match the GPS data from the cruiser. The language of resistance he used didn't line up with the footage of Leona's hands open and still. "You claim she attempted to flee," one agent said, pointing to a still frame. "But here she is stationary with her hands visible. Care to explain?" Murney shifted in his seat. "Situations escalate quickly. Officers have to make split-second decisions. You wouldn't understand." The agent raised an eyebrow. "No," he replied, voice dry, "but the law does." Outside, the sun had risen fully, now light filtering through the narrow windows in soft golden streaks. The hallway buzzed faintly with whispered conversations and shuffling footsteps, but in the small interview room, Leona sat still, her breath steady, her mind sharper than ever. She could feel the moment turning, could sense the weight of the lie beginning to break under its own pressure. And yet she didn't allow herself the comfort of relief, not yet. Not until she heard it. It came around noon. Officer Dale Murney, a voice called firm and clear, "You're being placed under arrest for filing a false police report, assault under color of law, and violation of civil rights." The station hushed as if the building itself had taken a breath and held it. Murney, once bold, now stood frozen, his confidence stripped bare by the echo of his own actions. As they cuffed him the very way he'd cuffed so many before, he looked over his shoulder just once and saw Leona standing in the doorway. She didn't speak. She didn't smile. But her eyes held something he hadn't expected to find. Not revenge, not satisfaction, but clarity. And in that gaze, something inside him folded small, mean, and hollow. She watched them walk him out of the room, the sound of his boots now heavy and uncertain on the tiled floor. And in the silence that followed, the weight in her chest finally shifted, not gone, but lighter, as if something too long held in had finally been set down. The morning after Murney's arrest, the town felt different, not louder, not angrier, just clearer, like the fog had lifted, and people could finally see things they'd chosen not to before. Outside, the courthouse reporters gathered in loose circles, holding microphones like weapons, their voices hushed but urgent, waiting for a statement that would confirm what the rumors had already whispered. Inside, the halls echoed with footsteps that didn't rush, and the silence felt earned, not forced. Leona sat on the stone steps just outside the east entrance, one leg bent, one stretched long, her back straight, and her gaze focused on something only she could see in the distance. Beside her sat Regina, dressed not in her robe, but in a long black coat, her hair pulled into a sharp, clean bun, the kind that never moved, even when everything else did. They didn't speak for a while, just listened to the wind move between the columns and watched the sunlight spill slowly over the concrete, warming their faces without quite touching their skin. A pigeon landed near Leona's foot, pecked at something invisible, then flew away. The world moved on. But they remained still. "You did good," Regina said finally, her voice low and even more like a breath than a sentence. Leona didn't look at her. "I'm not sure it's over," she replied, eyes fixed on the horizon. "I'm not even sure it started." Regina nodded once, almost imperceptibly, then folded her hands in her lap. "That's how it is. Justice doesn't arrive with trumpets. Sometimes it just walks in through the back door and sits quietly until someone notices." Leona exhaled slowly, the weight of the last 2 days still lingering in her shoulders, still alive in the bruise that ached when she blinked too hard. People had started to recognize her, not with cheers or praise, but with cautious glances, whispered conversations, sideways looks that said, "Is that her?" She didn't crave attention. She hadn't done this for the spotlight. But she also knew silence had never protected her, and it wasn't going to start now. Later that week, the department released a public statement, thin and polished, full of language like regret and ongoing internal review, but it didn't name names and it didn't carry the weight of the truth. What did matter were the hearings that followed the open sessions held in the high school gym, where folding chairs were arranged in careful rows and residents lined up to speak not just about Leona, but about years of quiet mistreatment, about names they hadn't dared say out loud before. It was messy, it was emotional, and it was real. Leona didn't speak at the first hearing. She sat in the back, watching, listening, letting others fill the space that had once felt too dangerous to step into. But at the second hearing, when a woman named Teresa James, 68, retired teacher, broke down mid-sentence talking about the night her grandson was dragged from their porch, Leona stood up. She didn't plan to. She just rose one hand, resting gently on the back of the chair in front of her, and walked to the microphone. "I wasn't supposed to be here," she said, voice steady but not loud. "I was supposed to be a law clerk helping on the edges of real cases. I didn't want to become one." The room hushed, not out of shock but out of recognition. "But here's the truth," she continued. "When someone believes they can beat you, lie about you, and bury you in paperwork because of who you are, because of your skin, your gender, your silence, they're not just attacking you, they're testing the boundaries of the world we've all agreed to live in." She paused then, not for effect, but because her throat tightened and she needed a second to breathe past it. "You can't fix what you won't name, and we've spent too long pretending this isn't happening." A quiet ripple moved through the crowd, nods, tears the slow shifting of weight as people leaned closer, not wanting to miss a single word. "I didn't win anything," she said. "I just refused to disappear." After that night, things didn't change overnight, but they did begin. Officer Cowley resigned. The footage from that night was made public. And Murney, facing formal charges in federal court, hired a lawyer who kept dodging cameras and questions. The town council announced an independent audit of the department. Policies were reviewed. New trainings were implemented, and though some people still whispered that Leona had overreacted or made things political, more people began to say her name not with suspicion but with respect. Weeks later, she returned to school. Not because things had quieted down, but because she had promised herself she would finish what she started. Her classmates greeted her with awkward warmth, some unsure what to say, others apologizing for not saying anything sooner. She accepted both with the same calm nod, her backpack slung over one shoulder, the weight familiar but lighter now. On one afternoon in late spring, she sat again on those courthouse steps alone, this time watching children race by, with kites fluttering behind them like tiny flags of freedom. The wind tugged gently at her hair, and she closed her eyes, letting it move through her, not away from her. The courthouse behind her stood tall, its stone columns catching the sunlight just right. She didn't need to turn around to know it was still there. She'd built her life to walk beside it, not inside it. And as the day moved on and the sky opened wider and the shadows grew longer across the concrete, one simple truth settled inside her, like a whisper from somewhere older than pain. Dignity isn't given, it's claimed. And once claimed, no one has the right to take it from you again. What happened to Leona Hayes wasn't just about one night, one officer, or one act of violence. It was about a system that too often confuses power with righteousness and silence with peace. Her story reminds us that dignity is not a gift, it is a birthright. And when that dignity is threatened, when the truth is buried beneath reports and uniforms and fear, it takes uncommon courage to stand up, speak out, and demand the light. This wasn't just a legal victory, it was a moral reckoning. For every viewer who has ever felt dismissed, overlooked, or unheard, Leona's quiet resistance stands as a powerful reminder. The strongest voices don't always shout. Sometimes they wait, they endure, and when the moment comes, they speak with clarity that cuts through the noise. And for those of us watching, especially in our later years, it's a call to remember that the fight for justice is never over. We may not be on the front lines, but we carry the memory, the wisdom, and the responsibility to ensure the next generation has a place to stand. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something deep inside, anger, hope, recognition, please don't keep it to yourself. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that speak to the heart of who we are and who we still have the power to become. Because stories like Leona's aren't just meant to be heard, they're meant to be remembered.